This is support material to our written submission from Ben Lomond Local Area Committee on the draft local strategic plan advancing our region towards 50,000. Its main purpose is just to provide evidence and verification of our presentations to you guys, in particular to page 87 of the draft, item B1.8, and we hope you find it interesting as well. The Ben Lomond district and community stretches over 3 local government areas, and therefore it's at the outskirts of those 3 council areas. It's been basically looking after itself since the 1800s, and other than big things like roads, it's managed itself and raised funds, developed its halls, done everything within community. The Landcare Group was founded in 1992 and originally began in traditional landcare ways, but it was also the organisation with bank accounts and incorporated legal structure, regular meeting committee, so it soon took on a broader role like a Swiss Army knife for this community, re the village, the district, issues, grants, and so forth. Around 2005, we were then in Guyra Council, and we'd made some quite substantial progress with the village and some on-farm issues. Guyra Council decided to propose changing the village zone and implementing some subdivisions. And this was of concern to our community because one thing we did know is that people enjoyed the small, quiet rural village. And so as a Progress Association-like group, we had the role of how do we respond to this? So we decided we needed to, 1, confirm what our community values were rather than just thinking we have them right, and 2, develop some kind of established community vision, strategic plan, and forward view, giving us greater confidence that we're acting genuinely to the broader community in terms of issues and needs, and with a view to perhaps a final DCP encapsulating a forward vision. And so that led us to this challenge: how to get a zone, village and district plan, but one that's based on sound information, good principles, and is as reflective of the community as possible. We soon discovered that what we thought was going to be simple was not. And I think for any community going through this kind of process, this is a great diagram that we've come up with. You start with simplicity and naivety. When you get into it, you are overwhelmed often by the complexity, certainly for community members. But if you persist, you eventually come to an integrated, more professional understanding of things, even if it's at a very basic level. And out of that comes a simplicity and mastery. So on this particular project of our Landcare group, I was one of the community leaders. So I'm the pink dot on the far left. Then you've got our working committee, which is the orange dots, and the rest of the community in green. And we all start at the beginning with simplicity and complete naivety of the task ahead. Now, before we can engage a process with the whole community, we need to understand the issues for ourselves first, which is the initial task of the working group. And so you can see that myself and the working group get into the complexity. Our goal is to then educate the rest of the community so that we can get informed views and informed consensus that truly reflects the community. And so all the dots end up on the far right hand side. This is a perfect picture, and life is not perfect, but that was our goal. So we engage with a town planner who's worked with communities as well, and have them come and talk to us, and we invite anyone interested in the community to come along. And they come up with some basic points and give us some guidance of what we need to get our head around. And everyone who came to that meeting became our working group. And we had many meetings over the next year or so as we continued to gather knowledge, information, and also getting our own understanding together of how a strategic plan can work, how it has to fit in with local government and state structures, what the kind of issues are that need to be considered that are appropriate for that strategic plan. We also start talking informally to people in our community to get a sense of their perspective of things and their values and views, and looking at other communities and other examples. So having done all our homework, we go from this to this, where most of our working group has a fair grasp of the complexities, although it's still gelling for us, and it's time to start engaging with the rest of the whole community. Now, as I imagine you guys will understand, most people don't appreciate the value of strategic planning, or the fact that a lot of rules and regulations are developed for a good reason and a good purpose. Sometimes overkill, but broadly. But of course, when those things don't happen and things are unplanned and messy and things go terribly wrong, the same people will be very quick to talk about how stupid it was and someone should have planned ahead. And of course, people in our rural community are as busy as city people. So our first task was to present the case to the community of the need and value for working towards our own strategic plan. To essentially look after what we value and to look at what the community might want that's different to what exists. Now, there were also, coincident with us doing this, some major changes in New South Wales planning laws, which added some complication to our own learning and translating to the community. We identified a range of future issues or needs, and we also raised a core issue of what the village wanted to do. Does it want to have absolutely no change and stagnate? We then had a school and a general store. But that might well lead to the loss of the village, like most small rural villages had disappeared off the map over previous decades. Did we want to go for a considerable expansion of the village, which would bring some pretty significant change to the culture of the village, quite possibly? Or did we just want a little bit of growth so that we continue to grow at what is the right rate? And where exactly is that rate? What would work? Now, to this question, living here, we knew that the village was landlocked. So whatever the outcome was, it was, if there's going to be any growth at all, it was likely we'd need to consider options outside of the then existing 2V, which became an RU5 with the planning changes, village. And that then opens other Pandora's boxes. And with discussions with our then Guyra Council of what their concerns and interests were with development of any new residential land. We had a pretty good grasp of that. We'd seen what happened at Invergary and the issues that arose there, and some other areas, such as what's too big to mow and too small to hold stock, um, issues with water and sewage disposal, uh, new residences off a sealed road for economic investment costs of council, etc. There's also an issue with landowners versus community values. The community might decide it wants some residential houses, but there's only, well, basically one, maybe a few landowners that own land, and if they have no interest to release land for residential, then if they're not on board, there's no opportunity and it makes the exercise pointless. So we needed to present how we need to work with both community and landowners to see if there can be some common ground. And furthermore, landowners can't do whatever they feel like. Local government had its own constraints, so we also needed to explain and educate our community about the different planning layers from state government New South Wales down to local government shire level, then to our level if we develop a DCP, and also consequences for individual landowners and parcels of land, and building permits, building permission on a block, etc. So that was part of a necessary component of education process for our community. And from that comes, how does a village and district plan relate to all of those things and work back up? And then there's the question within our community of who and how do we make decisions towards a final plan with such a diversity of views and interests in the community. So we presented this to the community, that on any dimension, and there'll be many dimensions we'll have to consider as a community, take for example whether the village, no change, stagnation, some growth or maximum growth, there's going to be a range of views in the community, as you can see with the little green stick figures. And people always at one extreme or the other. Now, as we educate, we hope that people become more informed and there'll be a clustering of consensus on that dimension. And so a future determination in our future plan might be core around that consensus point, but at the same time, we want to be as inclusive as possible of the community as a whole. Otherwise, you create division. So we also talked about identifying that core consensus, but being more flexible to incorporate as much of the community's sentiment as possible. So those who don't agree with the core consensus at least become satisfied that with the way it's worded with a bit more flexibility, it's acceptable to them, and therefore we have a broad community consensus. Now, having established this process framework, we then tried to get into some of the meaty issues, and this is where we came unstuck. So, for example, we talked about the village and what potential available residential land existed currently. Individuals with closely, dearly held local knowledge about what was reserve, what was not, what was council road, what was a crown road, etc., was very passionately held, and everyone had a different point of view and different understanding. And so 70% of the meeting would go on debates to and fro between individuals of what may or may not be the realities. And it just wasn't possible to get past that to engage in a meaningful way with discussing the core issues. So we realised that before we went any further, we had to do something about that. And so, with the help of Guyra Council, who we were discussing our intentions with, we went on a search for all of the data we needed to get accurate maps to resolve a lot of these issues. And for us, we didn't have GIS software, so we did ours in Photoshop with different layers, finding information and putting it into layers so that we could produce different maps and get some accurate information for effective real community discussion. And we printed out these maps and brought them to meetings, put them on the table. Now, once we did this, this really worked. A lot of the contentions and issues died away because people realised we had good information and some of what they thought actually wasn't true. And once that died down, people started to focus. They really valued the maps and the information and resolved issues. And they started to get much more available to talk about significant and real planning considerations. And we needed to consider both the village as it existed as an RU5 zone and the surrounding district. So we went out with the surrounding district to about 10 kilometres, although the Ben Lomond district extends further than that. And this was like 6 months to a year of work to secure all these things within our own busy lives. And knowing our then Guyra Council was firm on any new residences need to be connected to mains power, that was restrictive of where newer land blocks could be, but we got hold of the electrical infrastructure of our village and district to make sure we had a layer of that in our maps. We learned that the existing then tip has a 500 metre exclusion zone, so that was something we added. We also, being local, went round and worked out with people who owned land in the village who was available and open to any selling a block for a residence. We mapped out which were already taken up with the residents and what was reserves, crown lands, crown roads, and cultural things like the railway station, churches, school, general store. And then, of course, we need to consider that with the current village zone, given the then property owner didn't want to release any of the density of blocks in the middle there, to look at if there were options for extending the village zone with immediate land ownership around the village. Now, back then, we were all still on dial-up, which was becoming unmanageable to operate with a computer. NBN was not yet an announcement, but telecommunications were improving, and Telstra didn't reach our village for data. And so we looked at telecommunications. We also wanted any future village to be family friendly with kids who can run around the village. It's rather frightening when we had the general store that sometimes you'd get a car that would race through the village at 100 kilometres an hour. And the thought of a kid being killed and how that would fracture our community was certainly on a number of our minds. So we also looked at some street calming, and then we looked at other things like tourism and cycle circuits around our village and how we could have, the wool shed stay overnight for bikers from Sydney who want to do cycling tours. We looked at the Brothers, we looked at the railway station. We looked at a whole lot of different things to with our community. And having done all that, even though the land was all locked, we, just for the exercise of the community, we did a hypothetical to plan for the village of where it might work that met with council requirements, that looked at our future as a community, where we could put maybe some different land available for a general store, how we could do traffic calming, just to try and stimulate the community's thinking and get them more on board and to try and progress towards some consensus. Now, as we continue down this path, people start to realise this is a genuinely serious initiative that may well lead to outcomes. And what arose was, quite understandably, very strong concerns with landholders, both village but particularly in the surrounding RU1 zone, of what would happen with rates. You got to understand that this used to be very quite poor rural land back in the early 1900s. While the soil is good, the growing season was quite short. At the turn of last century, the 1900s, it was common for several falls of snow to be up to knee height. And so many families of up here have lived very minimal lives, fixed their own houses gradually over time, being workers on farms. Farmers here often they might make 20,000 net over the year, and today's equivalent money, but because they have their own chooks and so forth, they get by with that. And that's why Guyra Shire, out of the pressure from its ratepayers, always had rates about 30% less than the surrounding shires. Less services, low rates, because that was what worked well and underpinned this district and that local government area. And so at this time, with still many family-owned farms, it's changed in the last decade, the issue of rates and economic viability and impact of these changes as a strategic plan were of genuine and valid serious concern. So we needed to educate our community on how rates worked so that they could form a genuine for themselves informed view of what such an impact may well be. Like a lot of people didn't understand what rate pegging was, they didn't understand how the council rate system worked. And so as part of our process, we held seminars, some hall meetings explaining rates. The relationship is between land values from the valuer general with different shires, different rates, structure rates, different rate categories, and how the rates for a particular property is determined. And with that, then how rate pegging works, which was then 3.5%. And so even if your land values go up a lot, your rates may not. And we did some walkthrough accounting as examples, and we also did some future calculations, including the fact that Guyra Shire was contemplating a significant rate rise, and we also, in 2009, had almost a doubling of our rate valuations, simply because at the end of the 2008 drought, Ben Lomond and a patch to the east was the only green places in the state, and a number of very desperate property owners sold up out west and just bought land up here at huge prices just to be able to look out and look at green pasture. How rates work is simple once you understand it, but it's not simple until you do. And we were quite impressed the number of councillors turned up because they wanted to understand rates better as well. Our meetings were well publicised. And that did largely address this bugbear. And once again, we returned to effective discussions once those fears and concerns were put in correct perspective. Now, with the general store still in the village, we continued to engage in the community in a number of ways, including doing surveys on various questions on a Saturday morning to just explore the consensus of the community and the range of views. And we did one-to-one with people in the village and over the fence discussions. We worked in every possible way we could to keep drawing out what the range and extent of community values and interests and concerns were. Now, in regards to any land potentially available for even a small number of new residences in the village, we confirmed that it was pretty landlocked. The major landowner, just didn't believe anyone would be interested, didn't want to, and wasn't going to release any land, and in fact acted with council to turn it back to rural farmland. Apparently that wasn't gazetted, so your map is correct. So we looked at available blocks to expand the village zone around the edge of the village, and that's all valued agricultural productive land for grazing, so that wasn't available. Then when it came to looking at the surrounding district for small parcels of land that could be lifestyle blocks, what came back really clearly in our engagement more broadly in the district was that most of those blocks were on prime agricultural land. They didn't want to release it for lifestyle blocks. And in fact, the sort of nice bushy rocky knolls that weren't good agricultural land were part of big parcels of land, and there were questions about subdividing that to make it a lifestyle block. And so that's where we came to. However, this time we had a pretty good idea of things, and we put in what we saw as, irrespective of that outcome, a DCP type set of community values and rules. Things like houses not being built on top of hills, which was, the sort of down the coast sort of problem that they ran into, the block sizes, all those kind of things. We thought standalone solar was quite reasonable, so we didn't think houses need to be built with a power pole out the front, but certainly a sealed road was important. Setbacks, all those kind of simple issues. Houses in the village being consistent to the style of the village as a last century rural village, not something that was in conflict, all those normal kind of issues. Now, it's important to understand that finalising this process got overtaken by a number of other events. The GFC was in 2008, and following from that was economic stimulus packages, including the Building Education Revolution project, which involved a lot of our time and attention for the local school under that opportunity, and some various very strong issues. We also had the beginnings of Fit for the Future in subsequent years, and this got pushed to the side in terms of finalising it, putting it to council, though we did. Then we had the merger proposal, and of course all the consultations leading up to that process, including Boundaries Commission. And then it was put in just before the actual amalgamation in 2016 to Guyra Council. Not a formal DCP, but at least the principles of a DCP that we wanted to turn into one, talking it over with council. It's important to say that we need to recheck with our community and go through a process the next couple of years to affirm. We know that some of the core values haven't changed at all. We're very confident about that, but there are some changes, and we need to get some of our new arrivals on board with the process taking place and the fact that this was a 50-year plan. Now, I just want to show my files, and others here have done as much work as I have, and the range of issues that we ended up exploring, both for our community and more broadly. And indeed, it was our lobbying and engagement all the way up to the federal minister on telecommunications and working with the independent then that actually got the NBN as a rollout for Armidale as one of the 3 trial cities. That actually came from our proactive engagements. And just as representative of the magnitude of this complete work, just want to highlight that my files just for this process, and that's the core period of 2005 to 2008, was 1.54 gigabytes. And that doesn't include video or movies, it does include images and Photoshop files, a lot of that's documentation. That's the magnitude of the task that we undertook. While we didn't get a formalized DCP completed with all the confusions and challenges going on, this process was still a huge success. In our close engagements with our then Guyra Council, they came to really appreciate just how much money we were saving them, how self-organised we were, a level of competency, and we formed some good relationships. And so they decided they wanted to make sure they funded us so that we could move forward with a lot of our practical task list to fulfill our strategic plan, having basically formalised it within our community but not as a DCP yet. So Guyra Council proposed a budget of 10 or 20,000 recurrent each year, which they felt was still a considerable saving to them given what we saved them, so that we had stability to address the actual practical on the ground issues towards fulfilling our strategic plan. Now, the way this would work is that every number of years we would have a community consultative meeting where we'd ask the community to identify the issues of concern to them around the village and district, develop a big list. We have a voting system that determines what the community weighted balance of priorities are with each of those tasks. And then with that funding, we would talk to council where it involved them and select a subset to achieve over any given year. For big projects, we might look at some external one-to-one funding to expand that available 10 or 20,000. Now, we chose the 10,000 budget because we're a very small community with a limited number of active members, and being voluntary, we want to keep this enjoyable, not pressured. And so we had some meetings on February the 11th, the 24th, and March the 10th in 2009 to kick off the whole process. What I'm going to present next is outcomes since. So we've established core values, which you can see here, and we have our initial 2009 consult with the community on terms of specific practical things around the village and specific issues that we then incorporate into the larger structure of our community values and plan. And I just think it's really good to look at just the number of things we have achieved or we did achieve with that regular funding from Guyra Council up to 2016, 10,000 per year. I'm not trying to promote things, I'm just wanting it to be appreciated how well this worked. There are very few things we have not achieved. And I'm going to go into a couple of specific examples relevant to our future engagement from you guys with this community. So these are our actual sheets of the community consultation processes where we get the community to put all the things up on boards. Then we have a voting system where all the issues that people or tasks that people have put up get ranked. That gives our land care group / local area committee / progress association a list of specific issues which then we play into the larger goals, what funding we have, what resources we have, and I'm going to give some examples. Now, since 2016, of course, we've had the amalgamation, and while we were short of the funding, it stopped completely, so we've been totally defunded. That's been quite difficult. We had the 2017 to 2019 drought, bushfires late 2019 and voluntary evacuation of the village. And we had the village prepared for that 3 days before the RFS turned up. So that's part of the fruit of an organised community. And then we've had 3 good years, which has kept people on their properties, so not much available help as they recover from the drought, and wind farm state significant development, which we diligently assessed under the state planning process as a whole community over 18 months, and in the end we rejected it for what we believe are sound reasons, and the minister signed off on that. Now what you're seeing here is just one of many projects that have brought the village to its current state. This is putting in the exercise equipment. Behind there you can see our weather shed that had been restored, and our development of an electric barbecue which can be used during drought. We've already renovated the toilet by this stage. I'm pointing out here we are a very small community, and so often when we can do projects we have to be able to line up the available voluntary labour, sometimes or often local in kind or donated contributions of materials, expertise, and this is our community installing these things. It's not done at council cost or labour. And it's just an example of how this process has led to a much more organised community that is able to look after itself and function fairly independently, which we see it as an asset to a council. So here we have the Ben Lomond railway station, which is in the village. It's a very significant heritage asset. These are old photos. We did earlier arrange for its repainting to preserve it. Some of our community members prevent it being bulldozed when they close the railway line with real protest. We still value it a lot. It's got some land around it. We still maintain it and mow it. Now we tried to see how we could utilise this. The rooms are too small to run a coffee shop, and there's a lot of expense setting up coffee shops. We can't add structures because it's heritage listed and it blocks the heritage view. We looked at even things like railway cars as accommodation on the tracks if we restored the spare track. We've looked at trikes with the great cutting and the high point at either side of the railway station. We've looked at even an art precinct and sculpture park. We've members looking at rail trails way back before it was on Armidale Council's agenda. We really came to the conclusion that in the current environment, there wasn't really an effective way forward that had a confident outcome. And so we had to move on to a different focus. Essentially, we've done all we can, including some tourist signage, fencing, trimming of trees, securing some risks, all that kind of thing. I just thought I'd pop this in, an example of one of our land care meetings. Obviously not in winter. But we're a very small group of people who achieve an enormous amount of outcomes. So having explored all that, we come to 2016. We're facing an amalgamation. We've come such a long way, and we want to know how we utilise our achievement to some theme or purpose specific to our community, something we'd like to be unique, that's just us. And we come up with the notion of amateur astronomy. And that turns out to be a really good choice. Now, it turns out at the time we hit on this theme that there's only about 5 annual star parties, as they're called. That's gathering of amateur astronomers from a region, and including, for well-established ones, international visitors, to share their interest in astronomy, be all together in one place. And it turns out that we have an excellent and unique combination of assets that make us an excellent place for an annual star party. And our vision was to not only establish that star party once a year, but use that as an avenue to foster amateur astronomy over the Northern Tablelands to other small communities with recreation grounds. And we see it as attracting some major tourism to this region. There is no star party for Northeast New South Wales. So what we do is we contact all of the astronomical groups that we can find in New South Wales and southern Queensland, and we essentially propose an event, invite them to come and assess our assets, and ask them, do you think we are the right place for a new star party in Australia, annually hosted here for Northeast New South Wales? We adopt the name Stargazing Festival as a play on stargazing and being an agricultural grazing region. It goes down very well. We organise the first event for the astronomical community to come and assess our skies, the rec ground, the hall for wet weather and lectures, and hopefully remote lectures with an upgrade in the AV system. And here are some of the new arrivals on that occasion, from all the way from Sydney, Brisbane, UNE, out west. And look, it's very successful, and the outcome at the end of the 3 days is it was a resounding yes, that this is the great place for hosting an annual stargazing festival. Now, in years past 2017, we've held a few events since, but then had to suspend it due to funding and other issues and drought and COVID and so forth. The significance and opportunity of dark skies and holding star parties like our stargazing event has become much more into the press and limelight and other people's attention. Dark skies for astronomy, whether it be for serious amateur astronomy or just people in a city getting a chance to see some things with their own eyes, is becoming a really significant global issue. Therefore, preserving our dark skies up here is certainly a priority. This is a global map of the light pollution from civilization from a NASA-hosted Astronomy Picture of the Day site. And coming up next is the same satellite-determined data of light emission from the ground for our area, and you can see Armidale at the bottom, Inverell top left, Glen Innes to the north, Guyra a bit above Armidale, and Ben Lomond sits pretty much between Glen Innes and Guyra, with areas extending to the east in particular, well away from the highway, that also is away from highway headlights and truck lights, which pierce up into the sky. We're fairly protected because we've got hilly land between us and the highway, but the highway also makes us very accessible. Now, dark sky comes under local government legislation in New South Wales, but there's also international standards for dark skies, and they come at different levels of control of light, scattered light pollution, such as from house lighting, so forth. So we would look at probably a 2-stage intensity, 2 levels of dark sky to try and protect our dark skies. It includes our Ben Lomond village and why we need to stay a small village, and extends fairly much to the east. We have an opportunity here at Pinkett to have a particularly dark sky for the really serious astronomers as an extension of our annual festival. We're exploring that. And what's significant here too is the formation of a dark sky reserve for astrotourism needs to be coordinated across 3 local government areas, Glen Innes, Armidale and Inverell, for this to go ahead. And that really brings us to where our strategic planning, initiative of our community, our follow-through, the support of Guyra Council, our annual funding, our ability to complete a whole range of things that reduce public risk and provide further assets and resources, our land care's giving of all available funding from that was offered to us to other groups in Ben Lomond for namely the hall to improve facilities that not only are good for our rural community but would support this event. This is the potential that's been created by all our work as a self-organised community. And I think I will bring things to a close there. There is so much more I could present. But this is good enough, I think, to convey the message.